My blood dripped onto the living room rug, but the real agony was not the blinding slap from my own mother. It was the terrified eyes of my little daughter hiding by the doorway. They thought violence and manipulation could force me to my knees to shoulder their golden boy's massive debt. They had no idea that letting them sleep here tonight was not weakness, but the final net I cast to bury their guilty lives forever. Hello, dear listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to survive and keep creating content for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description and comments. My name is Emery, and this is my story. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night in Denver. The bitter Colorado wind was howling against the frosted window panes, rattling the glass in its frames. But the real storm had just violently kicked open my front door. Richard and Margaret, the two people I was supposed to call Mom and Dad, barged into my sanctuary without a single shred of warning. They smelled of stale airport coffee, cheap cologne, and desperate, unchecked entitlement. They did not come to visit their daughter. They did not come to check on their granddaughter. They came for blood, and they came for money. Margaret immediately slammed a thick, crumpled manila folder onto the pristine surface of my kitchen island. "Sign it, Emery," she demanded, her voice a shrill, grating command that echoed off the high ceilings of the house I had worked so hard to buy. "Your brother needs this commercial loan by tomorrow morning, and you are going to co-sign as his primary guarantor." I stared down at the dense legal paperwork. Wyatt, my older brother, the eternal golden boy who had squandered every single opportunity handed to him since childhood, wanted me to back a massive, highly risky venture. He was a deadbeat, a charming parasite who bled my parents dry, and now they were here to offer my veins to him. "I am not signing anything," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rapid, anxious pounding in my chest. "I am absolutely not risking my home, my credit score, and my daughter's future for Wyatt's delusions of grandeur." The rejection hung in the tense air for barely a second before Richard lunged forward. The back of his heavy, calloused hand cracked against my jaw with the brutal force of a swinging baseball bat. The entire world spun into a blur. I crashed hard onto the polished hardwood floor, my shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The sharp, metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth as my teeth cut into the inside of my cheek. My left ear started ringing with a high-pitched whine that nearly drowned out Margaret's immediate screeching. "You selfish, ungrateful wretch!" Margaret stood over my fallen body, her face completely contorted with ugly, unrestrained fury. "We gave you life. You owe us everything you have. You will sign these papers, or I swear to God, I will march down to your fancy tech company tomorrow morning and make sure they fire you. I will tell your bosses that you are mentally unstable, that you are a thief who stole from her own family. I will ruin your entire career, Emery." I tried to push myself up, my vision still violently blurring, when a small, frightened gasp cut straight through the madness in the room. I slowly turned my throbbing head. My 10-year-old daughter, Chloe, was standing exactly halfway down the wooden staircase. She was clutching her worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, her tiny frame shaking like a fragile leaf in a hurricane. Her wide, terrified eyes flicked back and forth from my bleeding lip to Richard's clenched fists. A primal, overwhelming surge of maternal terror and pure, unadulterated rage exploded inside me. They had brought their toxic violence into my safe haven, right in front of my innocent child. But as I watched them, I realized they had not really noticed her presence yet. Or worse, they simply did not care. More importantly, they had not touched her or harmed her. I absolutely needed to keep it that way. I needed to de-escalate this nightmare immediately. If I fought back physically right now, Richard might turn his unpredictable wrath toward the stairs. If I grabbed my phone and called the police right this second, it would turn into a chaotic, messy domestic dispute. It would be a nightmare that would traumatize Chloe even further, and without hard proof of their financial manipulation, they might just get a slap on the wrist for a simple assault. I needed a foolproof execution, not a sloppy emotional brawl. So, I forced myself to swallow the volcanic eruption of hatred bubbling in the back of my throat. I let the genuine physical pain throbbing in my jaw translate into fake, pathetic, broken sobs. "Okay," I whimpered, curling into a tight defensive ball on the floor. I played the exact part of the weak, terrified victim they always expected me to be, the role they had groomed me for my entire life. "Please, just stop. Do not hit me again. Please. I am sorry. Just give me until the morning. Let me calm down and read it over properly, and I will sign it when the banks open. I promise." Richard let out a harsh, disgusted snort, clearly proud of his physical handiwork. He adjusted his jacket, standing tall like a victorious, self-righteous conqueror. "See? Was that so incredibly hard? You always were a stubborn brat, until someone finally knocked some sense into your head." Margaret crossed her arms over her chest, her lips curled into a victorious, sickeningly sweet smile. "You are finally making the right choice, Emery. Wyatt truly deserves this chance." "It is very late," I forced the submissive words out, keeping my head bowed low, hiding the absolute ice-cold calculation that was rapidly solidifying in my eyes. "The roads outside are freezing. Why do you not both take the guest room upstairs? You can sleep here tonight, and we will sort out all the paperwork first thing tomorrow morning." They exchanged a deeply smug, triumphant look. In their twisted, narcissistic minds, their brutal violence and loud manipulation had worked perfectly. They had beaten the rebellious daughter back into complete submission. They grabbed their heavy overnight bags and marched confidently up the stairs, completely unaware that by stepping into my guest room to rest, they had just walked willingly into the darkest, most inescapable trap of their entire lives. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed a muffled 2 o'clock in the morning. The house was submerged in a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic breathing of my sleeping daughter. I stood in front of the master bathroom mirror, gently pressing a cold washcloth against my swollen jaw. The bruised skin had turned a sickening shade of violet, and the cut inside my mouth throbbed with every heartbeat. But the physical pain was a welcome anchor. It sharpened my senses. It washed away the remnants of the terrified, submissive daughter I had pretended to be just hours ago, leaving behind a cold, calculating void. After tucking Chloe firmly into her bed and promising her that everything was absolutely fine, my mind began to race. The adrenaline from the assault had faded, replaced by the chilling clarity of a puzzle missing its crucial pieces. Richard and Margaret were vile, but they were not impulsive. Their desperation tonight was sloppy, almost theatrical. Why barge in so late? Why jump straight to physical violence when Margaret usually preferred weeks of emotional warfare? And most importantly, why did they agree to stay the night so easily? They despised my house. They always complained about the drive. Agreeing to sleep in the guest room was entirely out of character for people who demanded instant gratification. I wrapped my dark robe tightly around my waist and slipped out of my bedroom. My bare feet made zero sound against the thick hallway runners. I crept down the stairs, moving like a ghost in my own home. I bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for the dimly lit living room, where Richard had carelessly abandoned his battered leather briefcase beside the sofa. I knelt beside it, my heart hammering a steady, controlled rhythm against my ribs. The brass latches felt cold against my fingertips. With agonizing slowness, I popped them open, wincing at the soft clicks, though I knew the guest room was on the completely opposite side of the second floor. I pulled out my phone, lowering the screen brightness to its absolute minimum, and used the pale glow to illuminate the thick stacks of paper inside the folder Margaret had demanded I sign. I carefully slid the documents onto the coffee table. As I scanned the dense legal jargon, the blood in my veins turned to ice. These were not preliminary loan applications. These were final binding contracts for offshore shell accounts, heavily tied to a commercial real estate venture that reeked of illegality. And there, at the bottom of the fourth page, was my signature. It was a flawless forgery. The loops, the pressure points, the exact slant of my handwriting. They had not come here to intimidate me into signing anything. They had already done it. My eyes darted across the header of the next document, and a wave of pure nausea hit me. The corporate guarantor listed on the transfer sheets was not just me as an individual. It was Apexis Solutions, my employer, the cybersecurity firm where I held senior clearance. The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place, creating a picture so horrifying it stole the breath from my lungs. Wyatt was not just taking out a risky loan. He was actively laundering a massive sum of dirty money, millions of dollars, and Richard and Margaret were using my forged identity and my high-level corporate credentials to authorize the transfer through the Apexis secure servers. They were framing me for federal corporate fraud. But why the midnight visit? If the forgery was already complete, what did they need from me? I stared at the heavily bolded instructions on the final page of the bank protocol. The transfer required a final encrypted two-factor authentication code, a code that would be sent directly to the registered cellular device of the guarantor. My phone. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They did not stay the night to calm down. They stayed the night so they could sneak into my room or wait until I left my phone unattended in the morning, intercept the digital 6-digit code, and finalize the transfer before I even had my morning coffee. By the time I got to work, the money would be gone, and the digital footprint would point squarely at my IP address and my device. I would be looking at decades in a federal penitentiary, while Wyatt lived like a king on a private island. My initial burning instinct was to grab my phone and dial 911 immediately. I wanted the police to drag them out in handcuffs right this second. But the cold, rational part of my brain slammed the brakes on that satisfying fantasy. If the police arrived now, what would they find? A domestic dispute, a bruised jaw, and a briefcase full of documents with my exact signature on them. Richard would simply lie. He would tell the officers that I had signed them willingly, that we got into an argument, and that I was trying to back out. It would be my word against theirs, and the federal implications of the Apexis documents would drag me into a brutal, years-long legal nightmare where I was the prime suspect. I had zero concrete proof of their digital hacking or their intent to steal the authentication code. I carefully placed the documents back into the leather briefcase, arranging them exactly as they had been. I snapped the brass latches shut. I wiped my fingerprints off the leather with the sleeve of my robe. I was not going to call the police to report a simple assault. If my parents wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate treason and identity theft, I would let them. I would let them think they were the smartest people in the room. I stood up in the dark living room, looking up toward the ceiling where my parents were sleeping in my guest bed. They wanted to use my house to destroy my life. Instead, I was going to turn these four walls into a flawless, inescapable trap, and I was going to let them dig their own graves right in my kitchen. Morning sunlight pierced through the kitchen blinds at exactly 6:30 in the morning. I was already stationed at the stove, meticulously flipping thick strips of bacon and whisking farm-fresh eggs. The rich, savory aroma of roasting pork and freshly brewed French roast coffee filled the open-concept living space, a stark contrast to the ugly, metallic taste of blood still lingering in the back of my throat. I had spent an hour applying just enough cheap concealer to make my swollen, bruised jaw look like a pathetic attempt to hide my shame. My shoulders were slumped. My gaze remained strictly fixed on the marble countertops. I was the very picture of a broken, utterly defeated woman, entirely submissive to the harsh reign of her superiors. Richard and Margaret descended the stairs right around 8 o'clock, looking completely refreshed, as if they had spent the night at a luxury spa instead of the home of the daughter they had just physically assaulted. Margaret wore my plush white bathrobe, tying it tightly around her waist with an arrogant flourish, while Richard strolled in wearing his crisp slacks and a smug, immovable grin. "Good morning, Emery," Margaret sang out, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, maternal cadence that made my stomach aggressively churn. "I see you finally decided to be useful. Is the coffee ready?" "Yes, Mom," I mumbled, keeping my voice barely above a weak whisper. I poured 2 steaming mugs and carried them to the dining table with trembling hands. "I made breakfast. I hope you slept well." "Like a baby," Richard grunted, taking a loud, obnoxious sip of the dark liquid. He did not even bother to look at my bruised face. "Have you printed those signature pages yet? I want this done before 9 o'clock. "I will do it right after I wash the dishes," I replied meekly, turning my back to them to hide the vicious, predatory smile spreading across my lips. While they were deeply engrossed in devouring their bacon and eggs, I walked over to the smart home control panel mounted discreetly beside the pantry door. To anyone else, it was just a thermostat and lighting controller. But I was a senior security architect at Apexis Solutions. When I bought this house 2 years ago, I had personally wired every single room with state-of-the-art, covert surveillance technology. I tapped a specific rapid sequence of 4 buttons on the touchscreen. Instantly, 7 microscopic lenses hidden inside the smoke detectors, the wall clocks, and the bookshelf speakers silently blinked to life. They began rolling pristine, 4,000 pixel resolution video and crystal clear audio directly to an encrypted, off-site cloud server that only I could access. The stage was officially set. The cameras were rolling. All I needed now was for my actors to perform. I walked back to the kitchen island and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. Under the table, out of their line of sight, I completely disabled my biometric lock and removed the 6-digit alphanumeric passcode. My device was now completely unsecured and wide open. Furthermore, using a secure backdoor protocol I had set up on my laptop the night before, I had rerouted the Apexis authentication server requests. When Richard initiated the transfer, the system would send a beautifully fabricated 6-digit approval code to my screen. It would look completely legitimate, but it was nothing more than a dummy sequence designed to keep them on the hook without actually authorizing the release of a single dime. I set the unlocked phone down right in the middle of the kitchen island, the screen facing upward. "I need to go upstairs to wake Chloe and help her get dressed for the day," I announced softly, keeping my posture hunched. "I will be back in 15 minutes to handle the paperwork." "Take your time," Richard said dismissively, waving a piece of toast in the air. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps heavy and slow, but the moment I reached the second-floor landing, I sprinted silently into my home office and threw open my laptop. The live camera feeds illuminated my screen. I watched closely. Down in the kitchen, the second they believed I was completely out of earshot, Richard sprang into action. He practically leaped out of his dining chair and scurried over to the island. He snatched my phone with greedy, shaking fingers. Margaret stood right beside him, anxiously biting her perfectly manicured nails. I watched him swipe up on the screen. He grinned wildly when he realized there was no passcode blocking his entry. He quickly pulled his own burner phone from his pocket and tapped a few buttons to initiate their fraudulent transfer. Less than 10 seconds later, my unlocked phone illuminated with a bright notification banner. "Got it," Richard hissed in the video feed, his voice captured perfectly by the microphone hidden in the nearby fruit bowl. "The code is 472915. I am entering it now." "Hurry up, Richard," Margaret urged, her eyes darting nervously toward the staircase. "If she comes back down and catches us, we will have to force her to do it, and she might scream." "It is done," Richard declared, slamming my phone back onto the marble counter exactly where I had left it. He let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. The transfer is pending. Wyatt is officially a very rich man, and Apexis Solutions will be holding the bag for every single penny. I sat in the dark of my office, a cold, euphoric thrill washing over my entire body. They had just confessed to corporate fraud, unauthorized access, and identity theft, and I had it all recorded from 3 different high-definition angles. The absolute peak of this twisted family reunion happened right around 12 o'clock noon. The front doorbell chimed, and I walked over to open it, still playing my role of the subdued, abused sibling. Wyatt swaggered through the door like a cheap celebrity walking a red carpet. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive designer suit that he definitely could not afford, smelling of expensive cigars and unearned confidence. "There is my favorite little sister," Wyatt boomed, completely ignoring my bruised jaw as he pushed past me into the foyer. He practically skipped into the living room, throwing his arms wide open. "Mom! Dad! Tell me the good news!" Richard stood up and pulled Wyatt into a massive bear hug. "It is totally complete, son. $5 million, fully washed, and routing to your offshore holding company as we speak." Wyatt let out a loud, obnoxious whoop that echoed off the living room walls. He grabbed a bottle of my most expensive champagne from the wine rack, popping the cork right over my clean Persian rug without a single ounce of hesitation. He poured generous glasses for himself, Margaret, and Richard, completely excluding me. "I cannot believe it actually worked," Wyatt laughed, taking a massive gulp of the sparkling wine. He turned to look at me, leaning against the doorframe with my arms crossed defensively. A cruel, vicious sneer stretched across his handsome face. "Honestly, Emery, you are so incredibly pathetic. You really thought we were just asking for a simple loan guarantee? We practically owned your entire life before you even woke up this morning. You are going to be drowning in federal debt for the rest of your miserable existence, and you do not even have the spine to fight back." "Wyatt, leave her alone," Margaret chuckled, sipping her champagne with an elegant tilt of her head. She served her purpose. By the time those idiot tech executives at her company realized their security protocols were breached from her personal internet network, we will be drinking margaritas on a private beach in Belize. She will be entirely lucky if they give her less than 10 years in a federal prison. "Cheers to the sacrificial lamb," Wyatt toasted, raising his glass high into the air. Richard and Margaret enthusiastically clinked their glasses against his, their wicked laughter blending into a chorus of pure, absolute evil. I stood there in silence, absorbing every single vile word, every cruel insult, and every detailed admission of their grand conspiracy. They were laying out their entire criminal enterprise, their flight risks, and their malicious intent to ruin my life, all while standing directly beneath a hidden panoramic camera and a studio-grade microphone. I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands to keep myself from smiling. They thought they had entirely destroyed me, but they were simply rehearsing their own prison sentencing hearing. The dramatic irony was so incredibly thick I could practically taste it, and it was significantly sweeter than any champagne Wyatt could ever steal from my home. Right around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the champagne bottles were mostly empty, and my family was deeply immersed in planning their luxurious new lives. I quietly slipped my wool coat off the rack and grabbed my car keys. "I am sorry to interrupt the celebration," I announced, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "I just received an automated alert. There is a critical Tier 1 server issue at Apexis Solutions. I have to go into the office to reset the security firewalls. It should only take a few hours." Richard barely glanced up from his phone. "Just make sure you do not mess up the transfer protocols, girl. Go fix your little computer problems." I walked out the front door, climbed into my SUV, and drove away. But I did not head towards the sleek glass headquarters of Apexis. Instead, I merged onto the southbound interstate and drove straight into the heart of downtown Denver, pulling up directly in front of the heavily fortified federal building. I bypassed the standard police precincts entirely. I needed the big guns. I needed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the division dedicated to high-stakes economic crimes and corporate espionage. Sitting in a sterile, windowless conference room, I slid a sleek silver flash drive across the metal table to Special Agent Marcus Vance. He was a stern, sharply dressed veteran of the white-collar division who looked like he had not smiled in a decade. I calmly explained everything. I laid out the forged commercial loan documents, the unauthorized access to the Apexis corporate network, and the explicit, undeniable threats against my life and my daughter's safety. Agent Vance plugged the drive into his encrypted laptop. I watched his stoic expression slowly shift into a state of absolute, undeniable shock as the crystal-clear, 4,000-pixel video filled his screen. He heard the audio. He heard Richard admitting to entering the fraudulent code. He heard Wyatt bragging about laundering $5 million through an offshore shell company. He heard Margaret gleefully plotting to let me take the fall for a decade in federal prison. "Ms. Peters," Agent Vance finally spoke, pausing the video right on Wyatt's sneering face. "In my 20 years at the Bureau, I have never seen a victim serve up an airtight, multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy on a silver platter like this. You have given us the motive, the method, and the full confession." "I do not want them simply arrested for assault," I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. "I want them buried under so many federal charges that they will never see the outside of a cell again. But there is one problem. The transfer code Richard entered was a dummy sequence I created. The money has not actually moved yet. If you arrest them right now, Wyatt's lawyers will argue it was a failed attempt, and he might hide his other illegal assets." Agent Vance leaned back in his chair, a predatory gleam finally appearing in his eyes. "You are suggesting we let the transaction go through?" "I am suggesting," I countered, "that Apexis Solutions and the FBI collaborate to create a ghost account, a digital honeypot. We authorize the release of the funds on my end, making them think they have successfully stolen the $5 million. But instead of routing it to Wyatt's offshore holding company in Belize, we route every single penny directly into a federal asset forfeiture vault. They get the confirmation receipt, but you get the cash and the final piece of undeniable proof to lock them away forever." The FBI moved with terrifying, beautiful efficiency. Within exactly 2 hours, their cyber division had patched into the Apexis framework alongside my credentials. The trap was set. The shadow ledger was active. By the time I returned home at roughly 6 o'clock in the evening, the house smelled of stale alcohol. I immediately went to work in the kitchen, preparing a lavish, expensive dinner. I roasted a massive prime rib, whipped up garlic mashed potatoes, and glazed fresh asparagus. I was the ultimate dutiful servant preparing a final feast for the condemned. My parents and Wyatt sat around the dining table, laughing boisterously as they gorged themselves on the food I had paid for and cooked. Chloe was upstairs in her room, safely isolated from their toxic presence, watching her favorite animated movies. "You know, Emery," Margaret said, chewing loudly on a piece of beef. She wiped her mouth with a linen napkin, her eyes glittering with a sickening, totally fake sense of pity. "Since we are coming into a bit of good fortune, I am feeling quite generous. When we get settled, I might just send you a little something. Maybe I will buy Chloe a nice plastic toy, a $5 doll perhaps, just to show there are no hard feelings about last night." "That is very kind of you, Mom," I replied smoothly, pouring her another glass of expensive red wine. My bruised jaw pulsed, but I did not break character. I needed one last piece of evidence for Agent Vance. I needed to establish their immediate flight risk on the hidden microphones. I leaned against the counter, perfectly framing myself in the camera's view. "Are you all heading back to your hotel tonight, or are you staying here again before you leave the country?" Richard let out a hearty, arrogant laugh. "We are staying right here in your comfortable guest bed, little girl. Why pay for a hotel when we have a free maid?" "And the flight?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully innocent and completely conversational. Should I make sure breakfast is ready early? I do not want you to miss your departure. Wyatt slammed his hand on the table, grinning like a madman. We are flying first class, baby. United Airlines, flight number 842, departing Denver International at exactly 9:15 tomorrow morning. Direct to Miami, and then a private charter straight to our new beach house. You better have the coffee brewing by 6 o'clock sharp, Emery. We have a lot of millions to spend. 6 o'clock sharp, I repeated, offering them a soft, subservient smile that completely masked the lethal venom coursing through my veins. I will have everything perfectly prepared for your departure. The dining room filled with their arrogant laughter once again. They were completely blinded by their own greed and their absolute certainty of my weakness. They sat in my home, eating my food, mocking my pain, and proudly stating the exact flight details the FBI needed to coordinate their tactical strike. They thought tomorrow morning was the beginning of their glorious new empire. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow morning their entire world was going to burn to the ground. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7 o'clock on the morning of the third day. 0 hour had officially arrived. The rhythmic, heavy thud of expensive leather suitcases bouncing down the wooden staircase echoed through the house, shattering the morning stillness. Richard and Margaret marched into the living room, dressed flawlessly for their luxurious escape. Margaret wore a silk scarf and oversized sunglasses, already acting the part of a wealthy socialite, while Richard adjusted the cuffs of his tailored blazer. They looked completely triumphant, overflowing with a toxic, arrogant pride that practically suffocated the air around them. I sat perfectly still on the velvet living room sofa, my hands wrapped loosely around a warm mug of black coffee. Chloe was nestled closely against my side, her small arms wrapped tightly around my waist. I gently stroked her hair, projecting a total sense of calm that I knew infuriated my parents. They wanted me trembling. They wanted me begging on my knees. Well, Emery, Margaret sneered, stopping right in front of the coffee table to look down her nose at me. She did not bother to hide her absolute disgust. This is goodbye. I would say it has been a pleasure, but you have always been such a massive disappointment. Do try not to cry too hard when the federal investigators show up at your office next week. Richard let out a short, cruel bark of laughter. He grabbed his heavy suitcase handle, his knuckles white with greedy anticipation. You really brought this on yourself, girl. If you had just been obedient from the start, maybe we would not have had to use your little corporate credentials. But now, you are on the hook for $5 million. The bank is going to foreclose on this fancy house of yours. Apexis will throw you to the wolves, and you will be sitting in a concrete cell for a very long time. Margaret leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a malicious, venomous whisper. Wyatt is going to live like a king on those white sandy beaches, and when you are locked away, maybe the state will put little Chloe here in a foster home where she can finally learn some proper respect. My jaw muscles tightened, the lingering pain from Richard's brutal slap flaring to life, but my expression remained entirely carved from stone. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid washed down my throat, grounding me in the present moment. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just let their hollow, hateful words hang in the freezing air of the living room. I set my coffee mug down on the glass table with a soft, decisive clink. I wrapped both of my arms securely around my daughter's trembling shoulders and pulled her face directly into my chest, shielding her eyes. Chloe, sweetie, I whispered softly into her ear, my voice completely steady and radiating absolute safety. I need you to play a quick game with me. I need you to close your eyes, squeeze me as tight as you can, and count backward from 10 to 1 out loud. Can you do that for Mommy? Chloe sniffled softly against my sweater. 10, she began, her tiny voice shaking but brave. 9, 8. Richard scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes at the ceiling. Oh, for heaven's sake! Stop being so incredibly dramatic, Emery. We are leaving. You will never have to see us again. 7, 6, 5, Chloe continued, her voice growing a fraction stronger. Exactly as she said the word 4, the harsh, blaring ringtone of Richard's cell phone shattered the tension in the room. Richard casually pulled the device from his blazer pocket, his smug smile widening as he read the caller identification. "It is Wyatt," Richard announced proudly to Margaret, tapping the green button to accept the call. "He is probably already at the first-class lounge waiting for us. Hey there, son. We are just walking out the door right now." But the voice that exploded through the phone's earpiece was not the arrogant, victorious swagger of a newly minted millionaire. It was a high-pitched, completely hysterical scream of pure, absolute terror. Even without the speakerphone turned on, the sheer volume of Wyatt's frantic panic filled the entire living room. "Dad! Dad! Help me! They took everything!" Wyatt shrieked, his voice cracking violently. "The offshore accounts are completely frozen. There is zero money in Belize. The balance says zero. Dad, the airport security just locked down the terminal. There are federal agents everywhere. They have guns. They are surrounding the gate. Dad, they know. They know everything." 3, 2. Chloe whispered against my chest. The color instantly drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking like a decaying corpse. His phone slipped slightly in his trembling grip. He stared at the screen, his brain desperately trying to process the catastrophic collapse of his entire world. Margaret froze, her jaw dropping open in silent, paralyzed horror. Slowly, agonizingly, Richard turned his head to look at me. He saw me sitting there on the sofa, entirely unbothered, staring back at him with the cold, unblinking gaze of a predator watching its prey fall into the spike pit. The realization hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The dummy code, the delay, the calm acceptance. I had not surrendered. I had orchestrated their entire execution. "You," Richard breathed, the word vibrating with a deep, guttural sound of pure demonic rage. "You did this. You set us up." "One," Chloe finished softly. A primal, blood-curdling roar ripped through Richard's throat. He transformed instantly from a smug conqueror into a cornered, rabid animal. He dropped his phone, letting it shatter against the hardwood floor. With his massive fists clenched and raised high above his head, he lunged across the coffee table, his eyes burning with the singular, violent intent to rip my life away. Richard's fist was mere inches from my face. I did not flinch. I did not close my eyes. I just held Chloe tighter. And then, the heavy, solid oak of my front door practically exploded inward, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces across the foyer. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, drop to the floor right now." A heavily armed tactical team swarmed into the living room like a tidal wave of black Kevlar and blinding tactical flashlights. The sheer concussive force of their sudden entry completely paralyzed Richard mid-strike. Red laser sights painted his chest and forehead in a dozen glowing dots. Agent Vance stepped through the shattered doorway, his gun drawn, his face a mask of absolute authority. "I said, get on the ground." In a state of pure, unadulterated shock, Richard collapsed onto his knees, his hands instantly flying behind his head. 2 tactical officers grabbed him by the shoulders and slammed him face first onto the polished hardwood floor. It was the exact same spot where I had bled just 2 nights prior. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the most beautiful, satisfying symphony I had ever heard. Margaret shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure denial, as another officer forcefully pushed her against the wall. They cuffed her wrists tightly behind her back, patting her down as she sobbed and begged, crying out that there had been a terrible mistake. I slowly stood up from the sofa, keeping Chloe tucked safely behind me. I smoothed down the front of my sweater and walked calmly across the room. I stepped right over Richard's writhing, pathetic form without sparing him a single downward glance. I walked directly to Agent Vance and retrieved a small, encrypted solid-state drive from my pocket. "The final audio and video backups from this morning," I said, my voice completely steady and clear, "including his full confession and the phone call from the airport." Margaret twisted her neck to look at me, her mascara running in thick, ugly black lines down her cheeks. The absolute despair and horrifying realization in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She finally understood that I was not the weak, subservient prey they always thought I was. I was the architect of their total destruction. "Take them away," Agent Vance ordered. And just like that, the two monsters who had haunted my entire existence were dragged out of my home, kicking and screaming into the cold, unforgiving morning light. Exactly 1 month later, the dust had fully settled. The federal prosecutors did not hold back. Wyatt was intercepted at the airport gate by heavily armed marshals. He, along with Richard and Margaret, were hit with a massive, airtight federal indictment. They were charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate espionage. Because they were deemed extreme flight risks with offshore connections, the judge firmly denied them bail. They were facing decades in a federal penitentiary, their precious luxury assets completely frozen and seized by the government. They were utterly ruined, permanently stripped of the power and money they worshipped. As for me, the federal asset forfeiture laws included a very specific, very generous whistleblower protection protocol. For successfully identifying and assisting in the seizure of the fraudulent $5 million, the government awarded me a substantial percentage of the recovered funds. I was financially secure for the rest of my life, entirely free from the corporate grind and completely untouched by their toxic debt. Now, on a beautiful Friday evening, I sat on the wooden porch swing of my Denver home. The Colorado sky was painted in brilliant, breathtaking strokes of deep orange and vibrant purple as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The evening breeze was cool and perfectly crisp. There was no more fear hiding in the shadows of my house. There were no more parasites waiting to drain me dry. I wrapped a thick, woven blanket around my shoulders and smiled, closing my eyes and simply listening. Right beside me, Chloe was reading out loud from a worn, beloved fairy tale book. Her sweet, melodic voice floated over the quiet neighborhood, narrating a story about a brave princess who outsmarted the dark, wicked wolves of the forest. I leaned my head back against the swing and let out a long, peaceful breath. The monsters were finally locked in their cages, and this beautiful, hard-fought dawn belonged entirely to us. Thank you so much, dear listeners, from the bottom of my heart, for staying with me through this incredibly intense journey. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from today, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's story and want to support our channel, please consider donating just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or use the PayPal link located in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our hardworking staff, help them feed their families, and keep bringing you more thrilling, high-quality stories every single week. Stay safe, stay strong, and never let anyone steal your peace.